What comes after the US-led world order? Today on Scouted, professor and author Amitav Acharya joins us to talk about the contributions of the non-Western world to international order, the decline of the post-World War II international order, and what comes next. Hi, I'm Jennifer Lind, editor of Blue Blaze. Today in our Scouted series, we're joined by Amitav Acharya. He is Distinguished Professor of International Relations at American University in Washington, D.C., and he's a past president of the International Studies Association. His research has reshaped how we think about global order, norms, and the role of the Global South. He has authored numerous books, including a 2014 book on international order and his new one, The Once and Future World Order, which we'll be discussing today. Few scholars have done more to rethink how power, norms, and the Global South are reshaping international politics. Professor Acharya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jennifer. Nice to be here.
Well, congratulations on your new book. This is really exciting. And so before we start talking about it, because I'm a social scientist, I always want to start with kind of definitional issues to focus the conversation. And you very much do this in your book as well. So I wanted to ask you about this concept of world order in general. It's a tremendously unwieldy concept, as you know. So how do you define it in your book?
Well, I defined it in the most basic way possible. One thing about this book, it's meant for a very general audience. It's not meant for social scientists or academics. It's meant for everybody. So world order for me is pretty much a distribution of power and ideas and interactions that are designed by its makers to create stability. Now, stability is not peace, but stability can facilitate peace and also prosperity, but it doesn't necessarily do that. And so also world order has to be little time specific. We have had world orders in the past, but when we talk about world order of a given time, it is about a particular length of time. And world order also is not global order. I make a very clear distinction. This is probably one of the most important things in my definition of world order. So I also think many civilizations can create world orders, even if these are not globally expansive. So there is a Chinese world order, there's the Islamic world order, there's the, Indian world order, and the like. As long as the makers of world order think their ideas and their way of conducting interstate relations is globally beneficial, is universal, that is a world order to me.
I noted in your book that the concept of order itself has really interesting roots. Can you talk more about that?
So the ancient Egyptians had this distinction between what is called chaos and order. So Maat is order, stability, justice, and Isfat is chaos or instability. So the conflict between Maat and Isfat, going back to ancient Egypt, can be found in many other civilizations, including India, Persia, including the United States. I mean, think about when American presidents talk about maintaining peace and stability in the world, order in the world, and dispelling the kind of chaos. This is basically a refrain that we have had throughout the last 500 plus years of known history.
You just kind of taking a step back. Why did you write this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wrote this book initially as a way of informing my students, my undergraduate students. So I started teaching a course in 2014, I believe, or 2013 at American University called Civilizations and World Order. And I was looking for a text, and of course there are many texts, but I wanted to have something that undergraduates can relate to. And at that time, the best-selling work was Henry Kissinger. It came out in 2014, World Order. I used this as a text and I still use it. But then I found, and I also, once I started using it, I said, I cannot just let my students use this as the only text. Because if you look at Kissinger's book, first two chapters comes from Europe, balance of power, Westphalia, and the concept of Europe. And then Islam comes next, the world in disorder. China and India, the oldest civilizations in the world, after Egypt and Sumer, uh, just get a little section in the middle chapters, and then we end up with the United States as the savior of the world. Books like Kissinger doesn't talk about racism, doesn't talk about Africa, doesn't talk about the pre-Columbian, the Maya, Inca, uh, Aztec, or Iroquois civilizations or systems. So I thought we need a comprehensive view. We need a view that also brings the rest of the world into the picture on their own terms. And of course, the West is important. I mean, there are chapters in Europe, chapters in the United States in the book. But Greece and Rome also is there, but I think that's not enough. So that was the reason for creating this narrative, alternative narrative. But then once I went along, I decided to make it more accessible to a general audience rather than just for students and academics.
I would just like to comment. I think it is incredibly accessible. I get a little daunted when I start having people talk to me about, the ancient civilization of Sumer, but because you're focusing on this particular theme of world order, and just because your writing is really interesting and clear, it's really amazing how you have made civilizations that seem quite distant, both temporally and then also we're just unfamiliar with because of the features that you talk about in the world today, where they're not given enough attention. I think it's amazing how accessible you've actually made them. So I could tell you and tell our listeners, this book is, despite being incredibly erudite and sweeping in its historical breadth, it is nonetheless accessible and really fascinating.
Thank you very much. It took a lot of writing and rewriting. So I was very conscious of the fact that the traditional academic writing that many other books are written edge, that's not going to work for what I have in mind.
So let me ask you to dig into this. A theme of the book is that aspects of order that are typically in the Western narrative credited to Western civilization actually stem from many other civilizations. So first of all, have very deep roots in history. They're not new constructs, and then also they're not Western constructs. So you discuss a few things like property rights, freedom of the seas, human rights, and so on. So can you tell us about some of these features?
This idea that there are other beginnings of concepts that we take for granted as Western uh, came to me not in the outset. It's a finding because as I did a lot of reading, interactions, teaching, and writing, I realized that actually many of these concepts, despite their naming, are actually have similar, earlier, maybe more foundational, maybe less perfect origins. Sometimes actually even more perfect origins. So let me start with there's a kind of a double standard here, epistemic double standard. When you use terms like democracy and human rights, just to give two very clear examples, we often go back to Athens, ancient Athens, Greece, and human rights to Magna Carta. But the Greeks really did not have democracy as we understand it today. Democracy was very limited. Only less than 15% of the people can actually have the right to vote. So it was kind of oligarchic. There were limitations. You have to do military service. You have to be a citizen. And women could not vote. That was the Athenian democracy. But more important, and this is really could be shocking to many people, that the Athenian democracy did not really have individual liberty. It was when Greeks talk about liberty. It was liberty of their polis, liberty of the city-state. So it's Athens liberty, Athenian liberty against Sparta, or the Greek Hellenists, their liberty, collective liberty against Persia. But if you are an individual, you challenged the authority of the city state and the rulers, you would be penalized. You have really no freedom of speech, or you could be either ostracized, or if the extreme, asked to drink poison and commit suicide, like Socrates. So just think about democracy without individual liberty and with very limited participation. We still think of ancient Greece as the inventor of our birthplace of democracy. And I have no problem with that. But why don't we give similar credit to the Indian, Chinese, Islamic civilizations who also developed ideas, but in a rudimentary form? And why don't we then give them credit for that? So we have a double standard. When it is from Greece, Rome, Western Europe, and it has some relations with the modern contemporary concepts and ideas, that's okay. But if it is from India, China, Islam, or Africa, we ignore it as unimportant or irrelevant. Now, there's a great quote from Robert Dahl that to deny the Athenians, ancient Greeks, credit for inventing democracy because their democracy was so imperfect is like saying that the Wright brothers did not invent the aeroplane because their aeroplane was so basic and rudimentary compared to the modern planes. Fair enough. So why don't we do the same thing about human rights, property rights, diplomacy, peace treaties, and the like? So they are using this as kind of an overarching kind of approach. I also found that there are many ideas and institutions were developed that are not quite what we have today, but they were foundational, just like Athenian democracy. So the first peace treaty between in the world that we know of, we have evidence of, was between the Egyptians and the Hittites in 1259. The Treaty of Kadesh is called. Well, that's a peace treaty. In fact, you can compare that with collective security, collective defense, non-intervention, even extradition. And I discovered in the book. But some people dismiss it because it was written in cuneiform tablets and was such a long time ago. And it didn't happen in Greece or Rome, but it happened or Western Europe. It happened in so-called non-Western civilizations. I found many examples. India, in ancient India, very clear principles of just war. When wars are just and unjust, but also protection of civilians, not harming combatants, almost word by word the Geneva Conventions. Second century to first century, the Code of Manu was developed. And we don't give them credit for inventing the modern principles of humanitarian warfare. So I found that in freedom of the seas. Freedom of the seas is the foundation of free trade, globalization.
When people think about free trade, I think there's a strong tendency to talk about free trade as something that grew out of the British and their leading role in world politics, later the Americans creating the GATT and the WTO along with other Western nations. But in your book, you talk about free trade in this Indian Ocean system. Can you say more about that?
There was de facto freedom of seas in the Indian Ocean. Anybody can trade there. Anybody can trade there as long as you pay duties. There were close to some 85 to 90 nationalities, traders of different nationalities in Malacca, which was a big center of trade, been bigger than Venice in the 15th century. Trade was managed by the traders. The Sultan never interfered. He just took some gifts, but there were a committee of 10 people, 10 traders from different nationalities that actually created many of the rules. And the rules are also codified. Rules of compensation, rules of, like if you have a collision in the sea, who pays who, so arbitration. So it was actually rules-based. So this is a pretty strong evidence of that trade can be open. And I don't like to use the term free trade, but it is basically the freedom of seas. The sea belongs to everybody. So that's another example. There are so many of these examples. Great Power Cooperation, cooperation among great powers in the Amarna period in the mid second millennium BC. Egypt and total of five great powers maintained peace for more than 200 years. Whereas the concept of Europe, the great power system that came in Europe much later, in the 19th century, lasted only 50 years. Just because the language is different, some of the customs are different, doesn't mean they were not addressing the same challenges. The order is a shared creation. Many of these ideas and institutions come from multiple places.
Can I ask you to follow up on this particular civilization of the Indian Ocean trading system? Basically, you challenge this idea, which is one prominent idea in international relations theory, that order needs to be supported by power. For example, that the post-World War II system was undergirded by American power. And then, of course, if you spin that view out, it suggests that the decline of U.S. power would lead to a decline in order. But as you talked about that trading system in the Indian Ocean, you said, quote, order propagates itself. And so it was this notion of localities and firms and tradesmen and so on, all being important in supporting that order and propagating it, rather than kind of presence of a hegemon underpinning all that being necessary.
Right. So that's a very important point. The idea of what we call in international relations theory as hegemonic stability, that economic openness or free trade and security depends on a dominant power. And the points of reference here are British hegemony, and then American hegemony. And that is not supported by history. Uh, so to me, this claim is a kind of a post facto legitimization by a bunch of academics of British imperialism and American, also kind of quasi-imperialism in many ways, the open door policy. Uh, of course, the great powers can support free trade, but they do it for their own purpose. History also provides alternative ways of creating economic openness, and alternative ways. That alternative way doesn't require a dominant power. A lot of our understanding of international relations world order comes from European Western history. So we glorify the British and the American world orders, providing free trade and security, but we do not pay attention to the Indian Ocean or other places where actually very similar, even more open concepts existed.
Often, if we're trying to ask about the beneficial effects of order, for example, economic order, the GATT system, the WTO system, the World Bank contribution to development, and so on. Often, and you discuss this in the book, that the metrics we typically use relate to GDP, right? So to what extent has GDP grown in the developing world? To what extent is GDP per capita higher, and so on? And if you look at those metrics, if you use those metrics to measure progress in the developing world, it looks pretty good, right? I mean, we see kind of astounding poverty reduction. We see tripling of real per capita income in developing countries. So economically, using those metrics, this looks like a phenomenally successful world order, not only for the North, but also for developing countries. But one insight that I was intrigued by in your book is that we should be drawing on other concepts, other metrics to measure this. So you talk about concepts from intellectuals who come from the global South, and they talk about human development or human security and so on. Can you say more on that?
Right. So First of all, the global south has done well, even going by the traditional metrics, because they started from a very low base. I mean, let's not forget that China and India were the largest economies in the world before the rise of the West. In fact, China was until the 18th, 9th century, until the Opium Wars. But then they all went downhill. A couple of 100 years of imperialism and colonialism, and I'm not being kind of ideological here. It's a fact. It's documented, not just in my book, but many other scholars, that the non-Western countries took a massive hit in their uh, overall economic output because of colonialism, European colonialism, and imperialism generally. But they're coming back from a very low base, so they are actually, in that sense, increasing their share of the world's GDP, even if you measure it in the traditional metrics. So there's some uh, studies, estimates that say that the global south countries will have more than 55% around that of the world's GDP, share of the world's GDP by 2050, maybe earlier. But then there's the alternative metrics of measuring progress and human development, which measures not just uh, the GDP, but the capacity of people, is enabling people to uh, have uh, the ability to earn an income and enhance the quality of their life, both economic life, but generally their social life. That's the contribution of Mahabubul Haq, a Pakistani economist, and Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen was kind of a supporting actor here, but it was Mr. Haq that actually developed this concept. And that the UN now has this Human Development Index, which is used by almost all the countries in the world, not only countries, but also states and cities as well. So that's an alternative measure. Then there is this idea of human security, which says that security is not for the government or the state or the people. So it actually redefines, broadens what is called national security. The security is for the state or the government or regime. So once you have that, the global south countries have actually themselves broadened the matrix. I'm not saying we should get rid of the GDP, although some people advocate that, but it is also another way of measuring development. And Amartya Sen put it, development as freedom, the ability, the freedom to develop your own capacity to achieve and realize your goals, economic goals, security goals, and political goals. So this is a very powerful broadening of the idea of development and security. And this is another example that I give in my book. The Global South have actually contributed new ideas about development, security, and ecology, rather than just borrowing and adapting what the dominant concepts of the West. Therefore, the world order that we have today, for a more just and fair world order, we need to also bring in the ideas and contributions of Global South, not just states, but also scholars and intellectuals and activists.
I asked earlier, and you gave several examples of different norms and conventions and so on. One of them was the responsibility to protect.
Yeah.
And I was really struck by your discussion in your book. It taught me a lot. And again, I think I had been in that category of people who thought this was a very kind of Western led construct. And that's not the case, right? That your book discusses where the impetus came from for that. Can you tell our listeners about that?
Yeah, this is yet another example of why or how the West gets exclusive credit for concepts and ideas that are emancipatory and progressive and liberating. So, of course, I would not say it's either West or the rest, but I think it's both West and the rest. I increasingly became convinced that particularly African countries played a very important role. African diplomats, leaders, and civil society. Because what happens after the Somalia crisis, 1992, that the United States, despite all the good intentions, basically say it can't really deal with this conflict in Africa. So it politically pulled out. And because of that, the UN also kind of lost interest. So the African leaders at that time, and we also had an African Secretary General from Egypt, Boutros Ghali, much maligned, but then Kofi Annan took over. But also we had Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, we had African diplomats, Francis Deng, later Mohamed Chanoun from Algeria. Uh, so they had this discovery that we cannot count on the UN or the West, because the West also controls the resources, to come to our aid. Most of the conflicts we have in Africa are domestic, intrastate conflicts. And the UN is not going to be reliable because the West is not going to let the UN focus on this. They felt kind of abandoned, neglected. They said we should do something. And they developed this idea of responsible sovereignty. I think there is a little bit of controversy who coined the term, but I think Francis Deng, from now South Sudan, he was working at Brookings, but also he was working before with the OAS and the UN on displaced persons. He played a major role. But more importantly, the Africans institutionalized it. So when the African Union was created out of the ashes of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU was all about sovereignty and non-intervention. The AU around 2000, the year 2000, started with the idea of humanitarian intervention in its charter, in its founding charter. And as we speak, there are 10 peace operations, about 10 peace operations undertaken by African Union, but also sub-regional groupings like ECOWAS. So Africans took the matter to their own hands. They do get support from the UN, but these are African-led. These 10 are only purely African-led operations. And they do get support from the European Union, but they play the leading role. And some of them have been failures, but some of them have been also successful. So it's not just responsibility just to protect, but responsibility not to neglect, responsibility to engage. And the norm of non-indifference is been created. So we cannot be indifferent to what is happening in Africa. And that's basically a contribution, African contribution to R2P.
In the book, you argue that the world is not moving toward a multipolar future, and you move away from this idea of multipolarity and polarity generally, and you have this really interesting construct of the multiplex. So, can you explain what you mean by the multiplex and why the polarity concept is not so useful going forward?
Yes. Multipolar is a kind of the traditional way of describing a world order that has more than two great powers. So we have unipolar, bipolar, and maybe tripolar and multipolar. So I am of the belief and opinion that a new way of managing and understanding and even creating a world order requires a new vocabulary. We are often prisoners of our words. So we often use terms that have been out there. Many of them came from Europe, European history, and we just should apply that to the rest of the world, and notwithstanding the changes that have happened since the words were first coined. Now, multipolar is a classic example because, where do we get the idea of multipolarity? Most of the time, we get them from Europe before 1945. So, when you have a bunch of great powers, Britain and France and Prussia, then Germany, Russia, Austria, Hungary, or before the separation. So we basically think that's what the model is. And then it changed to bipolarity and unipolar moment, and we're getting back to multipolarity. Now, so we are prisoner of thinking along those lines, that vocabulary. So I thought that's one reason why we should develop new ideas and new terms. Just like Joe Nye, he might not have coined it, but he popularized the term soft power to break this idea of the tradition of thinking that power is all material power, or power is economic and military power. Now, multipolarity, by the way, is about distribution of power. Distribution of power, what kind of power? Economic power and military power, material power. It really doesn't talk about ideas and norms or types of interactions. So interaction capacity is different from power. There are countries like Singapore and Taiwan, not great powers, but are very great traders. And the countries like Australia and Canada or the Scandinavians, they are great diplomatic in global diplomacy. So in economic and diplomatic interaction, we have really leaders that are not great powers. So multipolarity doesn't capture these actors, the middle powers, the regional powers, ideas and norms. So that's one reason why I think we need also new vocabulary. And another thing about this idea of multiplex and abandoning multipolarity, that if we use the term the 19th century, early 20th century, based on it, on practices of that period, then we also think it will end up like that. So what happened to multipolarity? Two world wars, right? And then bipolarity was more stable, according to some of the political scientists, which it wasn't actually, at least for the most of the world. Or unipolarity was actually benign. Liberal hegemony was benign under Americans, benign for all. So we became prisoners of also understanding and anticipating the future, prisoners of the past where the terms actually came about in thinking about the future. A new vocabulary allows you to think more clearly. I am not saying multipolarity is irrelevant, but it's only a small part of world order. It only explains the distribution of power and material power. That is multipolar, but that's not everything about world order. Ideas, interactions, other types of actors also matter, play an increasing role. Non-state actors matter, transnational civil society matters. So world order, in my view, is much broader than multipolarity, and polarity doesn't explain a lot of the things that are happening in the world with the involvement of so-called non-great powers. Every country, whether it's US or China, wants to be the primary actor within a given normative framework. So when Americans say China is actually stealing their narrative, it's not their narrative. China is actually exercising leadership by exploiting and drawing on a narrative that already existed, rules and norms, and the UN-based multilateral system. That doesn't mean China cannot take advantage of it, but just as the United States has taken advantage of it. But I think China and the US are not the only actor. There's a vast number of countries that belong to the global south that do not believe in either US or Chinese leadership or hegemony in the world. So there's India, which doesn't really want to work within a Chinese hegemonic system or American hegemonic system. Much of the global south is, if not non-aligned, wants a third way, but they can have a voice in world order. So I think this idea that there's US and China competition is going to determine world order is a bit oversimplified. And to give them, they will have an important role, but they're not going to decide world order on their own.
Again, it's bringing us back to the themes of your book about overestimating the role of the powerful and underestimating the contributions of many countries around the world. So I think that's such an important insight. Professor Amitav Acharya, congratulations on your new book. Again, we've been talking about the once and future world order. And this has been a really fascinating conversation. As I said, you've certainly taught me so much through this work, and on behalf of my students also, thank you so much for enriching the field of international relations and the conversations that we're having right now about the future of world order.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.